there for a change. In last week's lesson, Isaac got himself a wife. And in this week's lesson, we'll look at Jacob and Esau. And so let's begin by doing an overview of Jacob's life, and then we'll get into detail in chapter 25 of the book of Genesis. And as we'll see as we talk about Jacob, that God had his work cut out for him. He had a lot to do to mold Jacob into something he could use. So let's look at Jacob first. Jacob's father, Isaac, was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to be his wife. And in Genesis 25:23, God said this to Rebekah, "And the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manners of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the people shall be stronger, and the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger." And so Isaac and Rebekah had twin boys, and their name was Esau and Jacob. And Esau was the firstborn, so he was entitled to the birthright. And the birthright meant that he would inherit twice as much money and property and be the head of the family. And this was all according to the law, the Jewish law that they had called the Begorah law. And Esau grew up as a hunter of animals, and Jacob grew up as a shepherd. And as a young man, Jacob tricked Esau out of his birthright. And much later, Jacob tricked his father, Isaac, into giving him the blessing of the firstborn instead of giving it to Esau. And when Esau discovered Jacob's plan, Esau decided he's going to kill Jacob. And soon, he was going to kill him just as soon as his father died. And in the meantime, Esau had married a couple of Hittite women who constantly quarreled and made the life of Isaac and Rebekah miserable. And so Isaac told Jacob that he would have to depart and find him a non-Canaanite wife. And Jacob was to go back to the land of Ur in Iraq to find a wife from one of Abraham's relatives. Remember, Abraham was from the land of Ur, and he actually got Isaac a wife last week, as we discovered, from the land of Ur in Nahor. And of course, this was all part of God's plan because the journey would take several years, and God needed those years to teach Jacob a few lessons about what God expected from Jacob. And so Jacob left one night, and he traveled about 60 miles from home, and then he had a dream. In Genesis 28:13 says, "Behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham, thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereas thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed." And so in Jacob's dream, Jacob saw that God had stretched out a ladder between heaven and earth, and Jacob saw angels ascending and descending from heaven to earth and back on this ladder. And God assured Jacob that the promised covenant that he had had with Abraham and now with Isaac would also be made good to him also. But just like with Abraham, God had to mold Jacob into something he could use, a useful vessel. And Jacob's character was lacking, as we'll see as we talk about Jacob. But when Jacob arrived in Ur, he went to see Rebekah's mother's brother, who was called Laban. Remember Laban, this is the same Laban that we talked about last week. This is the same Laban that Eleazar dealt with when he got Isaac a wife. And so Laban, for 7 years, Jacob was to serve his uncle Laban because he was motivated by his love for Laban's younger daughter, Rachel. And they agreed to Jacob would work 7 years for her hand in marriage. Now, after the 7 years came for the wedding, Laban made the arrangements for a full week of celebration, and Jacob was all excited. The night finally came at the end of the week that Jacob would be married, and the wedding was at night, and the bride had on a veil, and it was dark outside, and so Jacob married and slept with the wrong woman. Laban had substituted Leah, his oldest daughter, instead of Rachel. And now Jacob was a good shepherd. He was a good worker. And Laban wanted to keep him in that role because he was a good worker and he was a good shepherd. And so Laban, through deceit there, wanted to keep Jacob. And now, of course, Jacob now had consummated the marriage with Leah. And in the morning, Jacob discovered his new wife was not Rachel. And when he confronted Laban about it, Laban said it was the custom whereby the firstborn daughter must be married before the younger daughter. But now Laban knew that all along, and he should have told Jacob, but he didn't tell Jacob. He deceived Jacob. But this deception was much like Jacob's deception of Isaac and his father, or Jacob's father Isaac and his brother Esau. And so Jacob got to feel what it felt like to be deceived. No doubt he looked back on his life and saw how sin and deception had caused heartache and pain to those that he had deceived, just like he was feeling heartache and pain from the deception of Laban. And so Jacob here learned a valuable lesson. As I say, God was teaching Jacob some valuable things. And so Jacob, he still loved Rachel. And so it compelled him to agree to Laban's terms to work another 7 years for Rachel's hand in marriage. But this time, Rachel would be his wife from the beginning of the 7-year period. And there's an old saying that, there's an old saying, shame on, I can't remember the old saying. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So that brings up the old saying, if I can remember it. But this meant that he would wait 1 week for Leah's marriage celebration to end, and then Jacob would marry Rachel, and he would have 2 wives. But even with all this deception going on, God continued to work to fulfill his plan for the nation of Israel. And today, this lets us know that today there's plenty of poor decisions being made every day. And God still can take all of those poor decisions and make the end result come out right. But the problem with that is that there's a lot of suffering in between. He still can make the decisions to come out right, but that doesn't mean that he can take away the consequences of those sins, which is the suffering and the heartache that sin causes. But to get back to Jacob, over the next 13 years, Jacob became the father of 11 sons and 1 daughter. And then through God's blessings, he became materially rich with the great flocks of camels and donkeys and sheep. And then, of course, his 12th son was Benjamin. It was born to him later. And so now 20 years have passed, and Jacob has been in the land of Ur, and God makes another call on Jacob. Genesis 32:9, last part, God said to Jacob, return unto thy country and to thy kindred, and I will deal well with thee. And so Jacob then knew that by returning, he was in trouble because of Esau. And so Jacob prayed in verse 11 for deliverance from his brother Esau, whom he had tricked 20 years earlier. And over the last 20 years, Jacob had grown spiritually from a man of deceit to a man of humility. And in answer to Jacob's prayer, God sent an angel in verse 24 to wrestle with Jacob to test Jacob's perseverance in doing God's will. And in verse 25 tells us that Jacob would not give up or be defeated, not even when things looked their darkest. As a matter of fact, Jacob's hip was dislocated during this struggle with the angel. But he would not let the angel go until the angel blessed him by changing his name. And his name was changed from Jacob to Israel. And the name Israel means struggle with God, because Jacob had certainly had a struggle with God during his entire lifetime. And but also Jacob had learned that what God expects, and beginning to learn what God expects of him to overcome his struggles. And he learned that put God first and let God handle it. He learned that do not fight God. Let God lead the way. And by leading the way, Jacob learned that God can work out problems. And God would work out problems with his brother Esau, who had sworn to kill Jacob if he come back, or when he come back. And so over the previous 20 years, Esau had become wealthy, and he came to meet Jacob with 400 men. But instead of fighting, Jacob let God lead the way. And in 33 verse 3 tells us that Jacob bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. And Esau could then see the humility in Jacob, and Esau ran to embrace his brother instead of running to fight his brother. And so Jacob had let God lead the way and let God solve the problem. And God wanted Jacob to show humility to Esau and not want to fight Esau. And how many people, this brings up the question of how many people today have things in their past that, that come back to haunt them. And I think that probably happens to a lot of people. It happens to almost everybody, that they've got things in their past that have been left unresolved. And the bad thing about it is they come back to visit you later, and people, instead of trying to face their problems, they cover up their problems and make the problem just like it didn't happen. And of course, that's not going to solve anything, to pretend something never happened. But if instead of praying and facing the problem, and they make it worse by just covering up the problem. But if the problem is due to our fault, we got to face the problem. We got to face the problem. We got to ask for forgiveness of something that we've done somebody a wrong. It's a very hard thing to do. Pride is a tough pill to swallow, no doubt. Amen. But it's what God expects. Matthew 5:23 and 24 tells us, the last part, speaking of someone who you have something against. It says, "Go thy way, first be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer the gift." So we have to ask for forgiveness. It's a hard thing to do. And it works both ways. If somebody's done something wrong against you, it's hard to forgive someone that's done something wrong to you, but that God expects us to forgive. And so it works both ways. We have to be willing to forgive. And that gets us ready to pick up. We will pick up now in chapter 25, verses 29 through 31. Chapter 25, 29 and 30. "And Jacob sod pottage, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, Feed me, I pray thee, and with that same red pottage, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom." Now the name Edom means red. And of course, later on, Esau would become father of the Edomites, and they were a reddish kind of people. But here, let's get into detail. Let's review a little bit first. At age 40, Isaac married Rebekah. We talked about, and Rebekah had the twins. What we didn't talk about was that she didn't just have them right away. After they got married, 20 years later. So she had problems having children also, but Isaac was praying during this time, and so after 20 years, she finally got pregnant and had twins with Esau and Jacob. And when they struggled within her womb, God told Rebekah that they would become the ancestors of two nations, with the older son serving the younger son. And then Esau, of course, we're told in the verses that Esau was a hunter of animals while Jacob was a shepherd. And at this particular time in their life, they were around 20 years old. Now, I know in the Muslim Talmud, what's called Muslim, it says that they were 15 years old. But looking at the other verses and other ages and figuring it back up, they were around 20 years old when this happened in their lifetime. And Esau enjoyed a life as a hunter, and as he was a skilled hunter. But on one occasion, after a long unsuccessful hunt, Esau is very hungry, and so he comes to Jacob's tent, exhausted, tired, and Jacob was cooking a stew. And Esau asked if he could eat immediately because he was near death. He hadn't had anything to eat. At this particular time in Esau's life, he was just a happy-go-lucky hunter. Come what may. He was just having a good time hunting. And in verses 31 and 32, "And Jacob said, Sell me this day thy birthright. And Esau said, Behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit this birthright to do to me?" And so, even though they were twins, Esau was born first. And that gave him the firstborn rights and the birthright and the best, and that was the best inheritance and the best prestige. And so Jacob said, "If you sell me your birthright, then I'll feed you." And Esau was exhausted, and he said, "What's this birthright to a dying man?" In other words, he thought more about his immediate need for food than he did about his future because he was young. And also, many people today, they need instant gratification. They don't plan for the future, and they want it right now, and they're willing to go in debt for it. But there's people that, put a cake in the oven, and they want to eat the cake before it gets done. They just want it, and they want it now. And then in verses 33 and 34, and Jacob says, "Swear to me this day," and he sware unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up, and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. And so, thinking that Esau might change his mind after eating and resting and getting his senses back, he thought that Esau might change his mind. So Jacob demanded Esau swear an oath to transfer the birthright to him. And the birthright carried responsibilities. And Esau, at this particular point in his life, he didn't want any responsibilities anyway because he was a hunter. He liked the independent life of a hunter, and he liked it with no responsibilities at all. So he didn't have a problem. As a matter of fact, verse 34 tells us that Esau even despised his birthright at this particular point in his life. But he only wanted to have a good time. But also, Jacob didn't deserve the birthright either. Jacob acted like a lot of dishonest people today who will do anything they can to get what they want, and sometimes it's at the expense of others. We live in a me generation today. Scams on every side trying to scam you out of your hard-earned money, and they go on, and they're good at what they do. I mean, they're very good at what they do. Some of them are so convincing that people do get scammed. But Jesus tells us in Matthew 5:42 to help those in need, not to take advantage of them. Now, before we go on, this is the end of chapter 25, but before we go on, I want you to understand that from the end of chapter 25 to verse 6 of chapter 27, which we're going into in a few minutes, 55 years pass. And now Esau and Jacob are now 76 years old. So, you have to throw those things in there because you read the Bible and sometimes you read a few verses and people have gotten old. Well, this is what's happened. They're both now 76 years old. And we'll look at some of those years in chapter 26. This tells us about what some of those years entail. Let's review just a minute for chapter 26. First of all, God renews his covenant with Isaac that he had given to Abraham. And next, a famine hits the land, and God commanded Isaac to go into Egypt, like Abraham, or commanded Isaac not to go into Egypt, like Abraham did. Abraham went into Egypt when there was a famine. He commanded Isaac not to go into Egypt. And so what Isaac did is he went to the Philistine city of Gerar instead, where Abimelech was the king. And just like Abraham also visited the land of Gerar, and Isaac mirrors Abraham's actions just exactly. He got into that land, and Isaac tried to pass off Rebekah as his sister. Remember, Abraham had done the same thing. But Isaac tried to pass off Rebekah as his sister because he was afraid for his life, because Rebekah was a very pretty woman, and there was men there that were inquiring about her, and so he tried to pass her off as his sister. And when Abimelech, the king, discovered the truth, it brought back memories of Abraham, I'm sure. But Abimelech, just like he did with Abraham, he protects Isaac, and he forbids anybody from harming Isaac's people. And Isaac, with God's blessings, was a wealthy man. He became more wealthy in the land of Gerar, but he was also a wealthy man outright because Abraham at this time had died, and he received Abraham's inheritance, which was much. And so one of the reasons that Abimelech was so good to Isaac is because Isaac was a very rich man at this particular time in his life. But this made the Philistines jealous. The Philistines were jealous of Isaac, and so they stopped up his wells. And Isaac digs new wells. And Abimelech, of course, he recognizes God's blessings on Isaac just like he recognized God's blessing on Abimelech. And so Abimelech seeks a treaty with Isaac, and Isaac agrees to the treaty. And so we can see from chapter 26 that Isaac was a very wealthy man, but he was also a sinner, just like you and I. Just like Abraham was a sinner, and Jacob's going to be a sinner, Isaac was also a sinner. But the point is that God's grace is sufficient. And through God's grace, God's will is going to be accomplished for the nation of Israel, not with perfect men, but with sinful men, just like you and I. And God's will today is going to happen because he can take this old sinful world and make those decisions come out right. But now we're ready to pick up in chapter 27, verse 6, and now Isaac is 137 years old. In verse 6, and Rebekah spake unto Jacob her son, saying, Behold, I heard thy father speak unto Esau thy brother, saying. And so now Isaac, as I said, he's 137 years old, and he did not know about the Esau selling his birthright, because that happened 50 years earlier. And Isaac was now 137. He was getting old, and so he believed that he might die. And so he asked Esau to come see him. And he asked Esau in verse 3 to go hunting for some wild game, some venison, and to cook it. And following the meal, then he would give Esau the blessing of the firstborn son, which included more and the best inheritance rights. And Isaac's eyesight now, at being 137, was very poor. And Rebekah overheard the conversation that Isaac was having with Esau. And Rebekah, she favored Jacob. It tells us that outright in the verses. It tells us that Esau was Isaac's favorite son, but Jacob was Rebekah's favorite son. But Rebekah overheard the conversation. Now, many years earlier, an angel had revealed to Rebekah in Genesis 25:23 that the elder shall serve the younger. And so she developed a plan for Jacob to get the blessing of the firstborn instead of Esau. And then in verse 7, this is Isaac speaking, Bring me venison and make me savory meat that I may eat and bless thee before the Lord before my death. And so as we see Isaac, now, you know, somebody 137 years old, they certainly might think they're going to die. But this actually didn't happen to Isaac, because Isaac lived till he was 180. But he didn't know that at this particular time. And in verse 7, Rebekah told Jacob the conversation that Isaac had had with Esau. Esau was to bring some venison, and after the meal, he would receive God's blessing on the firstborn son. Now, once a son receives the firstborn blessing, it cannot be revoked, it cannot be transferred, it cannot be denied. And so Jacob knew that, the birthright, and he knew that he had bought the birthright some 50 years earlier. And so he probably felt somewhat, I'm not trying to take up for Jacob's sin, but he might have thought that he was in the right, because he actually had bought the birthright some 50 years earlier. But it doesn't take away from what Jacob did. And then in verse 8, Now therefore, my son, obey my voice according to that which I command thee. And so Rebekah commanded Jacob to do exactly as she instructed. Jacob was to deceive his father and his brother in order to receive the blessings of the firstborn son. And once again, we see that instead of waiting on God to work the situation out, they develop a plan that's not anywhere near God's nature. God's not going to do anything deceptive. But they thought they would take it upon themselves. They should have been happy. They should have been happy for Esau that he was getting the rights of the firstborn. Today that happens to a lot of people. A lot of people get jealous of somebody rather than being happy for somebody when something good happens for them. But they should have been happy for Esau, because the time had come for him to receive the firstborn inheritance, which was mighty wealth. but instead of being happy, they were jealous. And then in verse 15, and Rebekah took goodly raiment of her eldest son Esau, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. And so Rebekah told Jacob to get 2 choice young goats, and she would cook the goats to copy the taste of wild game. And then Jacob said, what if Father touches me? Because Esau was a hairy man, and Jacob had smooth skin. And so Rebekah dressed Jacob in Esau's clothes to match the texture and also the smell, because he would be in Esau's clothes would be the same. And then Rebekah said that, she would endure any curse if Isaac did find out. She would endure the curse instead of Jacob. And of course, Rebekah did die. Rebekah died while Jacob was in Haran. So, that being said, in verses 16 and 17, Rebekah placed the goat skins around Jacob's arms and around his neck to imitate Esau's hairy body. And then Esau's his eyesight was failing him, and so they felt like, they could get away with it. And Rebekah reasoned that he would not know that it was Jacob. And so she cooked the meat and prepared the meal and sent Jacob in to see Isaac. And then verses 18 and 19, and he came unto his father and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, who art thou, my son? And Jacob said unto his father, I am Esau the firstborn. I have done according as thou biddest me. Arise, I pray thee, sit and eat of my venison, that thy soul may bless me. And so Jacob greeted his father, but there was a difference in the voice. And because there was a difference in the voice, the father asked, Who is it? And Jacob then lied outright, identified himself as Esau the firstborn. And then he continued with his lie, saying that he had done exactly what Isaac had requested. And of course, both Rebekah and Jacob, they were demonstrating a lack of integrity here. There's no doubt about it. You can't whitewash what they were doing. This was a sinful act. We should always be people of integrity. We should let God's plan reveal itself instead of taking the matter into our own hands. But many people today, they have problems because they don't understand certain things. I mean, many houses today are in foreclosure because people don't understand what they're signing. Some people sign what's called a variable rate mortgage. And a variable rate mortgage means that you have a low mortgage rate now, and then it increases gradually, and eventually it increases so much that you can't make the monthly payments. And then, of course, the house goes into foreclosure. So, there's still people today that do legal things, but they still cause people to lose their homes or whatever. But in verse 34 and 36, verse 34, and when Esau heard the words of his father, he cried with a great, exceedingly bitter cry, and said unto his father, Bless me, even me also, O my father. And so in verses 34 through 36, the plan worked exactly like they had planned it to be. Isaac pronounces the wonderful blessing on Jacob that includes agricultural prosperity, dominance of other nations, and even the blessing that God gave Abraham, the land of Canaan, and it was passed to Jacob. But a short time later, Esau comes in, these verses tell us, and they come back, and he sees what has happened. He sees his father, Jacob, has received the blessing, and when Esau found out, he cried out because he had lost his inheritance. Isaac then realized that Jacob had tricked him, and Isaac then he could not take the blessing back. And as a matter of fact, later on when Isaac does give Esau a blessing, it was just that Esau would dwell in an infertile land, dominated by his brother. But this was good for Esau because he went from being a hunter at age 76. Just 20 years later, he's able to raise an army of 400 men. So basically what this tells me is, that when, he hadn't done a whole lot his first 76 years of life, but the next 20 years he is able to raise an army, and it tells us of his wealth and stuff. Now we don't know that if he actually took all of Isaac's, because Isaac was very, very wealthy, if he got all of Isaac's wealth or not. But he was able to raise 400 men during the next 20 years when Jacob comes back to visit, or comes back to the land. But here we can see the suffering and heartache that sin and deception brings to a person. But also we can see that Jacob's going to get his just due too in next week's lesson when he gets deceived by Laban. We got any prayer requests this morning? Brother Nathan, you want to dismiss us